who's mañana. He said that doesn't really mean that we're going to do it tomorrow, but it is a polite way of indicating an intention at some time in the future to do something. He said, do you have anything like that in Arabic? The Arab thought for a while, and he said, well, we do, but it's really not that precise. And I must say, I found little precision in North Africa. I find even less precision in Latin America. I would like this afternoon to speak to you about U.S. interests and policy in Central America and the Caribbean. The focus of my remarks will be very heavily on the Caribbean Basin Initiative, which the President has proposed to the Congress. But I think that in order to understand that initiative, to understand its purpose, and to understand why we believe it is necessary, it is obviously necessary to place that in a broader context. Let me begin by summarizing very briefly what we see as U.S. interests in Central America and the Caribbean. Let me say that I will use the phrase Caribbean Basin, which is sort of a term of art designed to include both of those groups of very different countries. An English friend of mine recently accused me of being an imperialistic cartographer of the 20th century, trying to devise new geographic terms for units which do not really exist. I assured him that we do not consider that the countries of Central America are culturally similar to the countries of the Caribbean islands, but we do find that for us, there are certain similarities in terms of our interests in the region. There are certain similarities in terms of the problems we face, and we hope that by devising a program with sufficient flexibility, that program can serve equally well the needs of both groups of countries. So when you hear me talk about the Caribbean Basin, rest assured that I'm not trying to perform some cultural magic and group into one solid unit two very different groups of countries. U.S. interests in this region, I think, are quite clear if one simply looks at a map or thinks about it for a bit. Let me say at the outset that, in contrast to certain other areas of the world, our interests here are not primarily economic. We have economic interests in these countries, yes. We sell them significant, although not major, amounts of U.S. goods and services. We buy goods from them that are useful to us. By and large, however, most of the things that we buy from Central America and the Caribbean are things that we could buy from other countries if, for one reason or another, our access to their supplies were cut off. So that while our economic interests there are important, they are not dominant. Our dominant interests in this part of the world are first strategic and secondly political. They are strategic in the sense that as one examines a map of the region, one sees very quickly that some of our most vital sea lanes of communication traverse the Caribbean Basin. And here I do not refer only to the Panama Canal, which obviously has an importance all its own, but also to the normal sea lanes of communication which traverse many of the straits in the region. Some 50% of our imported petroleum, for example, comes into this country through the Caribbean Basin. Some 2/3 of our imports of strategic minerals comes through this region. In time of war or increased world tension, if we were to attempt to project force into the Persian Gulf or to support on a sustained basis our forces in Western Europe, a very high percentage of the supplies needed to provide logistical support would pass through the Caribbean Basin. So I think you can see why it is so important to us that we have unimpeded access to those sea lanes of communication, not only in normal times, but even more importantly, perhaps in times of international tension. Secondly, we have, it seems to me, a very vital political interest in this part of the world. I'm not here trying to imply that we should attempt to establish some sort of zone of exclusive U.S. influence over the Caribbean Basin, far from it. Other countries in the region, Venezuela, Mexico, etc., also have major interests and have major influence within the region. But it does seem to me that should we see in Central America and the Caribbean the emergence of an increased number of regimes vehemently anti-US in character and vehemently pro-Soviet in makeup, that cannot help but become a very major political setback for the United States, not only in this particular region, but it will also inevitably affect the perception that is held of us elsewhere in the world. So that we cannot simply be indifferent to political evolution within the Caribbean Basin region. It is of direct importance to us. And finally, in terms of U.S. national interest in the region, I would cite something which I would refer to as domestic interest. And this is something which manifests itself largely in the flows of immigrants, legal and illegal, into this country. And as we have seen repeatedly over the past decade, every time that there is severe political or economic instability in one or more of these countries, one of the first manifestations of that instability is an increased flow of people out of that country and in most instances toward the United States. Without comment on the rightness or wrongness of that, I would simply note that increasingly that poses heavy economic and social burdens on this country, and particularly in some regions of the United States, it is an issue of increasing domestic political concern. Let me summarize then briefly what our objective in the Caribbean Basin should, in my view, be. And that, I think, can be quite simply stated. It is that we seek a region at peace with itself, free from outside threats, able to devote its own energy and attention to economic progress and the development of democratic political institutions. In other words, security, democracy, and economic development are linked. Progress toward democracy is best achieved when a country's economy is developing well and when that country does not have to divert precious resources to defend itself against a threat to its own security. And a country is most secure when it can promise its people freedom and economic progress. Our policy, therefore, must have three dimensions: economic, political, and security. Let me take first the economic aspect of our policy. As one examines the countries in this part of the world, one is struck by the fact that they are, for the most part, very small, and their economies are, for the most part, very fragile. One also notes that over the past decade, they have suffered two devastating economic blows. The first was the increase in the price of oil. Unfortunately, most of these countries depend upon imported oil as a major source of domestic energy. We all know all too well what has happened to the price of oil over the past decade. The second blow that these countries suffered was that in the late 1970s and the first years of this decade, the prices of their primary export commodities, coffee, sugar, bauxite, cotton, have slumped very precipitously. So that they have been hit on the one hand with increasing prices for their essential imports, and on the other hand with decreasing returns from their major exports. The result has been a very serious balance of payments crisis, which, given the small size and fragility of these economies, has translated itself very quickly into very high rates of unemployment, very high rates of inflation, rising rates of bankruptcy, in some cases the virtual collapse of the private sector. This has obvious political consequences. The economic crisis is in fact so grave that the very stability of the region has been threatened. It has exacerbated, in many countries, long-standing, deeply rooted problems of disparity of income, economic and social injustice, etc. Over the past year, we have consulted very closely with Mexico, Canada, and Venezuela, beginning in July at a conference in Nassau. We set a set of common objectives, basically to encourage stronger international efforts to coordinate our own response to the needs of the region with theirs and those of the countries of Western Europe and Japan. As a result of these consultations, we have become a partner in a collective effort, which which now includes 4 other donors: Mexico, Canada, Venezuela, and now Colombia. Each of us is making a very significant contribution to the economic development of the region. Our collective effort is in fact quite impressive. Canada has just announced that they will double their aid flows into the region over the next 5 years. Mexico and Venezuela are providing, among other things, some $700 million per year to the countries of the Caribbean Basin through their concessional oil facility, which makes oil available to these countries at special concessional rates. The U.S. contribution to this effort was announced by President Reagan on February 24. He, in effect, has outlined a major and, in many ways, revolutionary program designed to promote economic progress, thereby enhancing peaceful democratic evolution and the security of the region. The President's program includes the following basic elements. First, as more or less the centerpiece of the program, a proposal to eliminate all U.S. import tariffs on products coming into this country from the countries of the Caribbean Basin, except for textiles, and to provide that duty-free entry for a period of 12 years. Now, as many of you will appreciate, this, in terms of U.S. international economic policy, is a revolutionary departure from the philosophy that we have employed basically since World War II. That is the principle of the most favored nation. For the first time, we have selected a group of countries, and we have in effect said to them that our interests in that region are so important, and our interest in their economic well-being is such that we are prepared to offer them entry into our market for their industrial and agricultural products on essentially the same terms that they would enjoy if, in fact, those products were produced in the United States. The second element of this program is a series of tax incentives to encourage U.S. investment in the Caribbean Basin region. The third element is a special request to the Congress for an emergency appropriation in this fiscal year of $350 million to assist in meeting balance of payments deficits and to assist the private sector in countries where foreign exchange at the moment is particularly scarce. The basic thrust of this policy over the longer term is a focus on trade and investment, a conviction that the reliance on the marketplace and market forces can make a true difference in their economic prospects. But we recognize at the same time that some of these countries, such as Costa Rica, Jamaica, the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, the small countries of the Eastern Caribbean, Haiti, face such urgent problems now that unless we increase our aid to them, it is very unlikely that they will be in a position over the medium term to benefit from the trade and investment initiatives, which are the long-term centerpiece of the President's program. And finally, on a continuing basis, this next fiscal year and beyond, we will increase very substantially our normal aid flows into the countries of the Caribbean Basin. In effect, we are doing this within a budget which is not growing. We are doing it by, in effect, giving a substantially higher priority to these countries than they have had before, and raising them in terms of priority over other groups of countries elsewhere in the world. The President's program is thus a bold and very unique combination of initiatives. It is designed to address the fundamental economic problems which have contributed to political turmoil in the region. It is based on the assumption that economic progress helps to enhance security and to promote its peaceful democratic development. The second element of our policy is the political element. And here basically I speak of support for democracy. I find, interestingly, that when I speak with groups around the country, I occasionally run into a certain reserve when I begin talking about support for democracy as a major element of our policy toward Central America and the Caribbean. A feeling that somehow we've been down that road before, we haven't seen that it led very far, and maybe other countries really aren't suited for democracy, and why should we invest any of our energy and political capital in trying to stimulate democratic development in those countries? I think the answer to that is rather simple. That is that we do not advocate democracy for these countries out of some romantic attachment to the concept that we ourselves have. Obviously, we do have more than a romantic attachment to the concept of democracy. But we advocate the establishment of democratic institutions in these countries because, having examined all of the alternatives, including what they have now and what is offered by the forces of the extreme left, we think that an attempt to evolve democratic institutions in these countries is the best option available to them. Why are democratic institutions so important? Because they provide a means, a channel, through which political, economic, and social issues can be addressed in a peaceful manner, and not with guns. They provide channels for the redress of grievances, the flexibility to resolve problems in a rational way before dangerous pressures build up and violence results. Through the elections, which are an integral part of the democratic process, they provide for a periodic accountability to the people by governments. In short, they provide the best political framework for stable economic and social development, and they are most likely to produce governments responsive to the needs of their people. Now, some suggest elections won't work if developing countries experience violence and turmoil. They say they can't be held in a bitterly divided country or one without strong democratic traditions. It is often asserted that elected governments are too weak to reform unjust social orders. In short, some would argue that freedom may have to be sacrificed to some greater good, that democracy is incompatible with economic progress. I don't accept this. We believe that democracy is as appropriate for the Caribbean Basin, for Central America, as it is for the United States. It is not widely realized in the United States, I fear, that of the 23 countries in the Caribbean Basin, 17 of them now have democratically elected governments. In other words, we are not dealing with an unbroken phalanx of right or left-wing totalitarian or authoritarian governments. Over 2/3 of these countries are already functioning democracies. In the last 2 years, 8 countries have held free elections. Costa Rica returned to democracy in 1948 after a civil war. Another country which came to democracy under difficult circumstances was Venezuela, after more than 6 decades of the most brutal and corrupt military dictatorship. Jamaica in 1980 held elections amidst violent civil conflict and economic collapse. Honduras this past January inaugurated a democratically elected president after more than a decade of military rule. And here in the United States, for example, we held elections ourselves during our own civil war, despite those who said it couldn't be done. The most recent test of the electoral concept was, of course, in El Salvador. This test was difficult, but it was neither new nor, as facts proved, impossible. The elections of March 28 for a constituent assembly were only the first step in a process designed to build a firm democratic tradition in that strife-torn country. There will be setbacks, and success is by no means assured, but we are confident that in the end success can be achieved. We supported elections in El Salvador, as we have in Honduras, Jamaica, and elsewhere. And we will continue to support democratic processes in El Salvador over the coming months. The Hemisphere has supported elections in El Salvador. The OAS General Assembly voted 22-3 last December to support elections in El Salvador, and voted 19-0 in February to send OAS observers. In addition, nearly all of the Latin American democracies sent missions to El Salvador to observe the elections. And don't forget the people of El Salvador. Perhaps they themselves provided the best answer to the skeptics and the cynics who would argue that elections are not possible and that democratic processes are not possible. Some 1.5 million people, over 80% of the adult population, turned out on election day and cast their votes. I might note that they did that despite a very concerted campaign on the part of the leftist guerrillas, first to persuade people not to vote, and secondly through the use of violence to intimidate people from going to the polls. I think that is a rather courageous and in some ways moving testimony to the commitment of the people of El Salvador to their belief that democratic process offers the best way to resolve conflict in that country. And then finally, there is the security dimension to our policy. The independence of sovereign nations can best be protected by reinforcing the hemispheric commitment to non-intervention. This commitment reached its full expression in the Pan American Conference in 1936, but the pledge itself is not enough. We must all face up to the fact that this pledge to non-interference is being violated systematically by Cuba with the support of the Soviet Union, and that the Sandinistas in Nicaragua are now collaborating with the Cubans, militarizing their own nation and supporting insurrection in attempts to overthrow governments in El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and Colombia. Even Costa Rica, that long-established democracy, is now being threatened. There are those who would accuse this administration of blaming Cuba for all of the problems of the Caribbean Basin in Central America. I would simply note that Cuban intervention is not, and I repeat, not, the source of instability in this hemisphere. The origins of violent conflict in Latin America lie in the historical, social, and economic inequities which have generated frustrations among people longing to improve their lot. Especially in the Caribbean Basin, national economic crises have subjected sometimes weak institutions to additional stresses, making these countries vulnerable to the appeals of violent radical groups. But it is demonstrably true that Cuba has demonstrated its readiness to exploit such situations, to take advantage of them for its own political ends, and that this activity on the part of Cuba in itself imposes serious obstacles to economic progress, democratic development, and self-determination. Our security assistance to the countries of the Caribbean and Central America is not an end in itself. It is only a means to an end. We seek to help these countries obtain the means to defend themselves. That is all they want, and that is all that we can appropriately provide. It is not appropriate, nor useful, nor necessary for us to take on directly the role of providing self-defense for these countries. They do not want it, we do not want to provide it, and it is not appropriate to the problems that they face. But we do design a program to support national efforts of building representative and responsive institutions, strengthening pluralism and free institutions, nurturing basic human freedoms, all of the things that extremists of the left and of the right would seek to stamp out. Again, the immediate challenge can be seen in El Salvador, but Cuba has been active throughout the basin, in places like Honduras, Jamaica, and Colombia. We have made a major effort to publicize Cuba's efforts, especially in this hemisphere. Through a combination of economic assistance, security assistance, and political support, and in cooperation with other nations of this hemisphere, we intend to counter Cuba's strategy of support for terrorism and violence in this hemisphere. Our message to Cuba is clear. We do not believe that the countries of this region will accept that the future of the Caribbean Basin be in any way manipulated from Havana. It must be determined by the countries themselves. For after all, what sort of a role model is Cuba to be recreated by force in other countries? A country where intellectual activity is repressed, where there is no freedom of speech or press, and no tolerance of dissent or opposition, where resources needed urgently for economic development are diverted to building a military establishment far larger than that needed for defensive purposes, where resources are diverted to Cuban adventurism abroad, not only in Central America and the Caribbean, but also in Africa, where people are so unhappy that 1.5 million and 1.25 million Cuban citizens have left Cuba since the revolution, one whose government is so incompetent that it must depend upon an annual $3 billion Soviet subsidy just to keep the economy barely afloat, one whose government has increasingly isolated itself in this hemisphere, one whose government assigns the highest priority to the promotion of terrorism and insurgency in Central America. In short, one whose objectives and policies are the antithesis of those of the rest of this hemisphere. In closing, let me return to the statement I made at the beginning. I said that our objective is a region at peace with itself, able to devote its energy and attention to economic progress and the development of democratic institutions. But I would note that these are not really our goals. They are the goals the nations of the Caribbean Basin have set for themselves. Our policies, economic, security, and political, are designed to help them achieve these aspirations. Thank you very much.
Mr. Ambassador, we thank you very much for that comprehensive overview. The Ambassador will answer questions. I'll recognize you. Yes.
I agree with you on Costa Rica, but what is the State Department's policy is Baby Doc and his Tonton Mahouts. You just siphon off to him and his followers, and the people in Haiti get worse. I've seen it. And I wonder what our State Department policy is in handling Baby Doc.
Well, we don't have a policy precisely for handling Baby Doc. We have a policy for trying to handle Haiti.
But he is.
Well, I would not argue that. No, what our current position regarding Haiti is that we do not have any major economic assistance programs in Haiti. They are very small ones. The only ones they have there are ones which are obviously dedicated to the basic human needs of the lowest level of the Haitian population. We have been working very strenuously with the Haitian government and with the International Monetary Fund to persuade the Haitian government of the need to impose a program of very serious administrative and fiscal reform. Because, quite frankly, our conclusion is that absent such a program of reform, that it makes no sense for us to contemplate sending large amounts of economic assistance to Haiti. We have to have assurance that those funds will go for the purposes for which they are intended and that they will produce some meaningful results. We are, at the moment, relatively encouraged by some of the things that we see in Haiti. Their new Minister of Finance has made rather substantial progress in bringing public sector spending under some semblance of control and rationality. They are, I think, quite close to a comprehensive agreement with the International Monetary Fund, which will be very important in terms of fiscal discipline. So that while the problems of Haiti are profound, I'm not a complete pessimist as to one's ability to perhaps have some degree of influence on it. The country is very poor, has far too many people. Once you've said that, you've really summed it up. And it has enormous political, social, and economic problems.
Yes, sir.
One, I'd like your opinion on the prognosis of, I believe, the Seattle government in Jamaica has recently elected Haiti. And two, in particular, your comments about investments that
Well, the Seattle government was elected in the fall of 1980 after a very acrimonious and difficult political campaign, ending, I believe, 9 years of rule by Michael Manley, who had taken Jamaica very far down the path toward state control of the economy, with ruinous results. The economic output of Jamaica fell every year for 9 consecutive years in the 1970s. In 1980, they were producing 25% less in terms of gross domestic product in Jamaica than they were in 1970. Seaga won the election. He won it quite handily. And he won on the campaign of economic reform, a return to a market system, and an attempt to turn around the Haitian economy. He's now had approximately a year and 4 months in which to begin that process. And I think quite clearly he has begun. Last year, for the first time in 10 years, there was a small, very small, but nonetheless there was growth in the Haitian economy. Unemployment has begun to come down, or Jamaica. 23 countries. Unemployment has begun to come down in Jamaica. Inflation is coming down in Jamaica. So that for the first time, people are beginning to develop some degree of confidence that the future may hold something better. Now, on the other hand, Jamaica continues to have very serious problems. One of the biggest problems they have is that during the period in the 1970s, a very large percentage of the managerial and technical class of Jamaica left the country and are now living in the United States, in the United Kingdom, or in Canada. And the country desperately needs those human resources. But as you can imagine, when someone has been living someplace else for 5 or 6 years, has bought a house, has a job, etc., he's going to have to be very certain about to what he is returning before he makes the other decision to go back. But I think that the prospects in Jamaica are quite good. They will continue to need large amounts of outside assistance over the next couple of years. We are providing large amounts of assistance. And they have to continue to make progress on economic reform, deregulation, and things of that sort. But they've got a good beginning. On the question of investment incentives, the investment incentive that was proposed to the Congress is a 10% investment tax credit for U.S. companies investing in the countries of the Caribbean Basin. The purpose of that is to, in effect, make investment in those countries more attractive from a fiscal point of view than investment elsewhere outside the United States. My own view is that while that is important and should be encouraged, in the short term, the most critical thing is to reverse the disinvestment that is now going on in the countries of the Caribbean Basin. In countries like Guatemala, Salvador, Honduras, Costa Rica, Jamaica, less so now, Dominican Republic and elsewhere, one of the biggest problems is capital flight. And it's one reason why banks in Miami have been doing so well over the last few years.
Mr. Stern.
Mr. Ambassador, I'd like to ask you 2 questions about Puerto Rico. First of all, does the Caribbean Initiative in any way affect Puerto Rico's economy and that their advantageous is now lessened because of policies that the rest of the nation has been taking? And secondly, what is the administration doing as far as follow-up with President Reagan's campaign talk about pushing state legislation?
I'll respond to the first of those. The second one is a little out of my area, in that the State Department, as you know, is specifically precluded from having any direct responsibility for the affairs of Puerto Rico. But with regard to the Caribbean Basin, the governor of Puerto Rico has been quite supportive of the Caribbean Basin Initiative. And I think as one examines their situation analytically, there is considerable prospect for some rather interesting, what one might almost refer to as trilateral investment operations. In other words, Puerto Rico is at a higher stage of economic development than most of the other countries in the Caribbean Basin, far higher. And yet, Puerto Rico itself has certain comparative advantages which position it well concerning entry into the U.S. market. And we already have evidence of some Puerto Rican investments in one of the Caribbean Basin countries to produce components for assembly in Puerto Rico and then export into the U.S. So I think that that concept is one which has considerable promise. Puerto Rico was somewhat concerned because they were afraid that in one product area, for example, rum, that they were going to lose some revenue that they had been obtaining. Actually, as one examines that, the most important aspect of that is that Puerto Rico receives from the U.S. Treasury a rebate of the excise tax which is collected on rum sold in this country. It is not so much the loss of the production that Puerto Rico feared. And we are now going to offer duty-free entry to rum from the Caribbean Basin, but the excise tax on that rum will be rebated to Puerto Rico so that they are kept whole financially. We are very conscious of the need to ensure that we do not in any way prejudice Puerto Rico as a result of the Caribbean Basin Initiative. After all, in some important respects, Puerto Rico is something of a model of what we have in mind for the trade and investment initiatives in the Caribbean Basin Initiative.
I read this press report that Secretary Hayes suggested that Cuba was agreeing something so that Cuba was going to be a rapprochement with the United States.
The question is the reference to remarks recently attributed to Secretary Haig suggesting that if Cuba would separate itself from the Soviet Union, that there could be a rapprochement between Cuba and the United States. Is that correct? Well, I know that considerable publicity was given to those remarks, which I think the Secretary has explained were not intended for public consumption, although they are not inconsistent in any way with U.S. policy. I think the thing I should stress is that this should not be taken as some dramatic new development. I mean, objectively, as one looks at the situation, that has been true for a long time. If Cuba would separate itself from the Soviet Union, if it would stop subverting or attempting to subvert its neighbors in Central America and the Caribbean, and behave as a member in good standing of the inter-American system, then there would in fact be no major barrier to better relationships with the United States. Now, the fact of the matter, however, is that up until now, we see no indication that Cuba is prepared to do those things. Cuba continues to behave in Central America, the Caribbean, and Africa just as it has been behaving for some time, despite the statements that one reads coming out of Havana indicating a willingness to change their behavior. One has not yet seen any objective evidence that the behavior has in fact changed. I think one thing that, this is kind of a personal observation that I have, but I think one thing to bear in mind is that kind of pose a question. Cuba now receives in total economic assistance in various forms from the Soviet Union about $3 billion a year. That's a lot of money. Now, some would argue that that could be compensated, the loss of that could be compensated for if Castro would simply take Cuba back into the inter-American system, resume trade with the United States, etc., and that the normal marketplace functioning would replace that $3 billion. Over the longer term, that might in fact be true, and I think it would be true. But the question I would pose is, could that sort of liberalization of the Cuban economy take place and still preserve the structure of political and security control which is necessary for Castro to maintain political power in Cuba?
Yes.
From Cuba, I appreciate your remarks on what do you see as Cuba's political and economic interest in these other strategies?
I think their interest is primarily ideological and political. They I think as we've seen periodically over the past 20 years, Castro believes that the process of revolution in Central America and the Caribbean is inevitable, and that it is in effect Cuba's historic role to assist in that process. We happen to believe that there is an alternative. I think I should stress very strongly that we are not advocating simply the retention of the status quo. We realize that change is inevitable. In fact, change is very desirable in many of those countries. But we believe that change, political change, economic change, and social change can be achieved peacefully, and that it does not have to be achieved through a process of violence. And particularly, we believe that there is an alternative to the Marxist-Leninist type of state control, which one sees in place in Cuba, increasingly in Nicaragua, and a political system which preserves economic freedom, preserves basic political freedoms for individuals. Now, that I think is Castro's primary objective in the region.
You stated that, in your opinion, two-thirds of the countries in the Caribbean Basin are democracies, and largely you based it on the fact that they hold elections. Well, you know, they hold elections in Russia too. I don't think anybody would even dream of saying, of stigmatizing them as being democracies. And yet we had
Not the Russians.
Yet we had the Mexican Sharks there here not so long ago. And when we asked him about the outcome of the elections, how was it possible that here these people are looking for economic progress and freedom and so forth, and yet the majority of them voted for the right? And his answer to that was that these people just don't know any better. They have their patrons, and they know that if anything happens to the patron, they're afraid that they will go down with the patron. So how are you going to do this without any kind of a land reform, and how are you going to get a land reform peacefully?
Let me take that question in two parts. First of all, let me say that I would not, by any means, compare the type of elections that one sees in most of those 17 countries that I cited with the elections that one sees in the Soviet Union. The difference is that in many cases, in the elections in the Caribbean Basin, they result in a change of government. They did in Costa Rica, they did in Honduras, they may well in the Dominican Republic next month, they did in Jamaica, et cetera, et cetera. They are meaningful elections. It is not just a fraud or a facade. There is real political change which results from those elections. And I think that the point I was trying to stress earlier is that I'm afraid that too many Americans have a tendency to consider that whole group of countries as just one collection of banana republics, and that they're all dictatorships, even though they may have an election once in a while. It's not really true. It may have been true at one time, but it is no longer true. Second part of the question with regard to El Salvador. I tried to say very carefully in my remarks that El Salvador has taken a first step toward the establishment of democratic institutions. They have by no means completed the journey. They have a long ways to go. They have elected a constituent assembly. That constituent assembly will now begin organizing the process for the next stage in the elections, which will be the election of a president and the election of a national assembly, the drawing up of a constitution, etc. Now, why did the majority of people participating in the Salvadoran elections vote for the right? Well, there are several things wrong with the question. First of all, there is a great tendency in this country, again, and to some extent I'm afraid that the government contributed to it. We identified the Christian Democratic Party as a party of the center, which means that everyone to the right of it was a rightist. The fact of the matter is that some of the people on the right are extreme rightists, no question about it. But others are far from extreme. They may be more conservative in terms of economic policy than the Christian Democrats, but they deserve not to have their democratic credentials called into question for that reason. Many of the members of the PCN, the Partido de Conciliación Nacional, were serving in the Christian Democratic controlled junta, are committed to the reform process. People in Arena, the party which has been dominated in the U.S. press by Major Bob, Roberto Dobison, many of those people do not deserve to have their democratic credentials called into question simply because they didn't vote for the Christian Democrats. You have to bear in mind the Christian Democrats were in the government for 2 years, 2 very tough years, in terms of the violence, in terms of the war, in terms of the economy. And I think that, as we've seen in other countries, there was something of a protest vote against the Christian Democrats. In fact, one could argue that the Christian Democrats did win a plurality, 41% of the vote. That's not bad under the circumstances with 6 parties running. So that one should not look at the 5 parties to the right of the Christian Democrats and say that that is a monolithic right beyond democratic redemption. It simply is not true. Now, there were certain elements in that election which were very attractive to many people in the Salvadoran election. The concept of law and order, not surprising, we've seen the same phenomenon in this country. The concept of law and order, stop the violence, was a very powerful political platform, and that I think accounts in some large measure for the success that Arena and the PCN did have. But to say that there was a victory of the extreme right in the Salvadoran election, I think is simply not correct. And one has to approach it with a good deal more analysis than that before one tries to draw any conclusions from it. When these parties get into the Constituent Assembly and begin arguing over things like tax revenues and budgets and all the rest, believe me, I'm confident that you will see that the right is not monolithic at all, and you will begin seeing some very strange alliances formed on particular issues.
Yes.
Yes, sir. Pursuing that particular theme, in reference to the rightist coalition that exists, you referred to the PCN Arena. Could you give an assessment of the president of the Constituent Assembly's action, Mr. Roberson, to block the selection of Magana as provisional president? The reason I ask is in relation to, as I understand it, we've committed approximately $180 million down there, and in order for them to receive that money, they're going to have to comply with 3 provisions that Mr. Hague has indicated to them, one of which, of course, involves giving an appropriate representation to the Christian Democratic Party. And if Roberson had just gone along and let Magana be selected, he would in fact be, as I understand it, just a titular head, because the Assembly, the Constituent Assembly, will in fact control all legislation as well as the new Constitution. So what did he have to lose by letting the man get in?
Well, first of all, I think it's very unclear as to what is or is not happening this particular 24 hours or yesterday in Salvador. It is a country which abounds in political rumor. This is the first chance that many of them have had to play politician in some years. They're making the best of it. So I think that I would not myself try to draw any conclusions from the events of the past, from the events of the past couple of days. I think it's important to bear in mind conceptually what is involved here. I mean, you have a Constituent Assembly, which is a sovereign body now in El Salvador. It is the only institution in El Salvador which legitimately reflects popular will. Now, we can like or not like the reflection of popular will, but that's what the people did. That Constituent Assembly has now, in a formalistic fashion, drawn onto itself the relevant power of government in the country. And presumably, when the provisional government is appointed, that provisional government will then be given certain powers, particularly in the day-to-day operation of the government, while the Constituent Assembly occupies itself with revising the Constitution and getting on with organizing the next stage of the election. So that, it's not as though there is some tug of war underway between the Constituent Assembly on the one hand and something else on the other. The Constituent Assembly is the name of the game. They then will organize the provisional government or oversee its organization. We have said that for our part, in order for us to continue providing economic and military assistance to El Salvador, we require certain fundamental things. We have not dealt in personalities, we have not dealt in parties, but we have dealt in terms of programs and policy. We say that in order for us to continue to provide that support, we must see a continuation of the process of political reform. That is to say, we must see the prospect in the not too distant future of the next stage of the electoral process. We say that we must see the continuation of economic reform. That includes land reform. Land reform, which incidentally, Rabbi, I would not simply write off. I think that it has made some rather substantial progress, has some implementation problems. It needs some new momentum. But there are there are a total of about 130,000 Salvadoran families which now have land which didn't have it previously. So, and finally, we've said that as an absolutely fundamental precondition, they must continue to make progress in controlling violence in the country. Now, those are not the administration's conditions, although they obviously are very compatible with our policy, but they are conditions which are laid down by the Congress in the legislation. And we must certify every 6 months that those conditions are being met. And if we do not certify that those conditions are being met, or we cannot certify, we must suspend aid.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Ambassador, what has become of the suggestion of the President of Mexico that he would offer his good efforts
Well, he made that offer, I believe, last January, February. We have had a number of conversations with the Mexicans, both before President Lopez Portillo made that public offer and after. Secretary Haig met in New York twice on 2 consecutive weekends with the Mexican Foreign Minister, Mr. Castañeda, to discuss the situation in Central America and to discuss the Mexican proposal and our proposal. As we examined the Mexican proposals with regard to Nicaragua, they covered really 3 countries, Nicaragua, Cuba, and El Salvador. But only with regard to Nicaragua were there any details in the proposal. The rest of it was all sort of general willingness to see a reduction of tensions in the region, etc. But as we examined the specific proposals with regard to Nicaragua, we discovered that they were very similar to the proposals that we ourselves had made to the Nicaraguans last August. They had to do with addressing Nicaraguan concerns over their alleged fears of imminent hostile action from the United States, our concern over Nicaragua's arms buildup, etc. There was one important omission, and that was that the Mexicans' proposals did not explicitly address the question of the flow of arms and support from Nicaragua into Salvador for the Salvadoran insurgents. And we had told the Nicaraguans, have continued to tell them, that the cessation of that direct support is in effect a sine qua non for the normalization and improvement of our relationships in other areas. Well, after a series of these conversations with the Mexicans, we then decided that we would attempt to reopen directly with the Nicaraguans the dialogue that we had attempted to establish last August. And in early April, under instructions, our ambassador in Managua presented 8 proposals to the Nicaraguans, covering again the question of Nicaraguan support for the Salvadoran guerrillas, but also covering such things as the alleged activities of Nicaraguan exiles in the Florida training camps, our concern over their arms buildup, the possibility for international verification of borders and arms flows in the region, the possible reestablishment of a U.S. aid program for Nicaragua. And we have since had a response from the Nicaraguans. Their response did not fundamentally address the substance of our proposals. It was more of a procedural response. We are now going back to them asking for more information, doing some more probing. And I think after we've tried to sort this out a little bit at this official level, it is not inconceivable that we will move to another stage in a more formal negotiation. But before we do that, we want to be sure that we have a clear appreciation for what Nicaragua's position is and they for ours. But the Mexican proposals remain there. I mean, we are trying to work in various ways toward the same objective. And there is no competition between the Mexican proposals and our own efforts vis-a-vis the Nicaraguans.
Mr. Dillon? There's been a fair amount of criticism of the press, the government's handling of the press in Nicaragua. Now that they're in El Salvador, now that there's an elected constituent assembly, it might be helpful to have cleaner and better press there. As it now stands, major articles in the Salvadoran press have to be submitted to the element of review. Is there any U.S. effort underway to get them to remove the restrictions on the local press?
Well, in point of fact, there really aren't very many restrictions on the Salvadoran newspapers. In fact, you'll find various former members of the recent government who would argue that maybe they should have placed more restrictions on the press. I don't happen to support that. But there is really quite an unfettered press in Salvador. Quite in contrast, of course, to the situation in Nicaragua. We have continued throughout our cooperation with the Salvadorans to make the point, which is, I think, only appropriate for us to make, that we consider that the establishment of a free press and the existence of a free press is one of the essential elements of a pluralistic society, just as we made the same point in reverse to the Nicaraguans. We find their continued closures of the press in Nicaragua as evidence that they are not following through on their earlier commitment to democratic pluralism.
Master, I'd like to say that I think that your policies that President Reagan has enunciated and that you've clarified for us are really well-founded. I wish them success, but just to keep ourselves a bit honest, I'd like to ask you how would you compare these policies in supporting economic development and democracy with what the United States did after the democratic election of Salvador Allende in Chile?
Yeah, Chile.
Well, first of all, I really am not familiar. I was not in this part of the world, working in this part of the world in 1973. I think that what has happened in Chile, looked at from a longer term, has been very unfortunate, because that was a country which, for decades, was considered to be one of the most effectively functioning democracies in the world, not just in Latin America. And as one sees the swings that that country went through, I think that what is often not fully appreciated, perhaps, by as many Americans as it should be, is that the surge back to the right in 1973 was in response to what had been a very definite surge to the left. The same sorts of things that we were just discussing here in terms of freedom of the press, economic policies which were considered by major groups of the Chilean population to be very prejudicial to their interests, et cetera, were very much a part of that picture. And I think that, as is so often the case, in order to have a swing to the right, there must have previously been a swing to the left, and vice versa. That's one of the great virtues of centrism.
Yes.
Well, it depends on whose ox is being gored. I think that by and large, the other countries of South America in particular recognize that these small countries of Central America and the Caribbean are not, even with these preferences, going to be primary competitors of theirs. If you look at a country like Brazil or even Peru,